Good morning, everyone. Hi, thank you for coming in. So I am Monica Joe, and I will lead us in our panel discussion today about changing organizational culture, how to get started on centering racial justice in the housing and homelessness field. We are so happy that our discussion gets to follow the great opening plenary, with Amanda's words about recognizing the role we all play as gatekeepers and becoming co-conspirators. That was really touching. We now get to look at what racial equity work actually looks like at our organizations. The issue of racial injustice is overwhelming and heavy, and many people are left wondering what they can even do to address the inequities that exist within the housing field. As the Racial Equity and Inclusion Program Manager at the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, I've been able to see the power that organizations have to influence the field of affordable housing and to advance equity and belonging. We can all work to make sure that the people who are creating housing opportunities reflect the communities in need, as it will make our work stronger and better. Change has come in many forms, including internship opportunities like NPH's Bay Area Housing Internship Program and CCRH's Rural West Internship Program that train students of color in the field of affordable housing development and project management. Organizations are also hiring consultants to help them walk through an assessment process and create internal plans for change, along with staff committees to help implement those plans. Organizations are also looking at hiring practices, contracting policies, leadership development, and retention to see where we can advance opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to grow and succeed in this field. Here today, we have 3 women of color to share their experiences of bringing this work to their organizations, acknowledging that the work is tough and ongoing, but is something that must be a priority. There's so much work to be done, and it's going to take all of us chipping away at the problem in order to create a more equitable and forward-thinking industry. So we have here today with us, Dr. Valicia Adams-Kellum, who is the president and CEO of St. Joseph Center. Since Dr. Adams-Kellum joined St. Joseph Center in 2008, the agency has tripled its staff, expanded its services, and broadened its geographic reach to encompass all of LA County, with major service centers on the West Side, in South Los Angeles, and in downtown LA. Dr. Adams-Kellum holds a gubernatorial appointment to the California Department of Housing and Community Development's No Place Like Home Program Advisory Committee. She also served on and continues to support the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority Ad Hoc Committee on Black people experiencing homelessness, as well as the National Alliance to End Homelessness on Race and Equity Issues, Thank you so much, Felicia, for joining us. We also have with us Erica Holzauer, who is the Rural Development Specialist 2 at the Rural Community Assistance Corporation, also known as RCAC. So Erica joined RCAC in 2012. She works with communities and agencies to plan, finance, construct, manage, and operate affordable housing in rural communities. She provides bilingual technical assistance and training. Erica develops training curricula and uses adult-centered learning techniques for multiple teams at RCAC. She is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee's chair at RCAC and has participated in this committee for the past 4 years. Thank you very much, Erica, for joining us today. And last but not least, we have Lillian Lou Haler, who is the Vice President of Housing Development for MidPen Housing. Lily uses her training as an urban planner and over 15 years of experience as an affordable housing developer to create vibrant, sustainable, and inclusive communities. She recently launched a corporate vendor diversification program to align MidPen's contracting practices with its mission and values. Lily has contributed to the production of over 4,500 new homes. And with the development of each one, resident move-in day remains her favorite. So thank you to our 3 panelists for joining us today. And before we begin, I'd like to kick us off with a poll to see how everyone is feeling today about this work. This will be a 2-part question to see where you are in your racial equity journey and where your organization is in its journey as well. So please feel free to respond to the poll. And I'll give everybody a minute to do that. Looks like we might be having some challenges with the poll. Okay. All right, so for some folks, it looks like it showed up. And if we can have the results show up of the poll. Okay, so it looks like we have 80% of the participants are ready for action. Some just need a little push, which is great that you're here with us today. And as far as your organization and their readiness, we do have about half who are already doing this, some who are ready to get started, and a few who really want to engage in this work but might need a little bit of help. So I really hope that you gain a lot out of this session to really just get this work started. So thank you very much. And I hope that now that you see that many of you are in the same boat, that you can feel sort of this peer support here. And that's really what we want to foster with this session. So now I'd like to kick it off to Valicia to talk about the work that St. Joseph Center has done in its internal policies and hiring practices. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Monica. And it's so wonderful to be here with everyone. I wish we were in person, but I'm really excited about our conversation and loved this morning's plenary. I'm going to pull up my slides now and we'll be able to get started. So thank you again. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about St. Joseph Center. We've been serving low-income and homeless individuals for over 40 years. And we started as a small nonprofit in Venice, California, and have now grown out with services across Los Angeles and the county. Our mission is to provide working poor families, as well as homeless men, women, and children of all ages with the inner resources and tools to become productive, stable, and self-supporting members of the community. This picture here shows you the fierce sisters that started the agency long ago. And like many of our agencies, we have a mission and a focus to help the most vulnerable. Like many of the agencies that are represented today, you're serving the most vulnerable and likely an abundance of people of color. Today, St. Joseph Center serves 10,000 people annually in 4 main areas of service: outreach and engagement, housing, mental health, as well as education and vocational services. But what we've seen since the beginning of the pandemic and what we felt when we saw George Floyd take his last breath is that what we've been doing in our work, feeding those who are hungry, housing those who are homeless, helping children get back to a normal life if they've lived in cars with their parents or have had trouble in educational spaces. We've done all of that without asking, I think, a very important question. Why are you here? Not just why our clients come for help, we know that, but the systemic issues that they face. We often call ourselves the boots on the ground, the frequent responders, the first responders, the whatever it takes advocates. We are the ones on the ground, the boots on the ground, those who are right there when clients need it most. So we should be the first to speak about the real reason they are with us. And that is because of racial disparities and inequities that the pandemic showed very clearly, and in the brutal murder of George Floyd, which inspired all of us to begin to use our voices and to speak about a thing, to not just serve people, to not just be advocates, to not just be developers or housing providers, to be in fact, representatives of the voiceless, and to speak to the inherent disparities in our country. Oh, they are mighty. We know. We've seen them all too well, that African Americans and Latinx in the US have been 3 times more likely to contract COVID-19. And they're nearly twice as likely to die from it than our white counterparts. African American women die from preventable pregnancy-related complications at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women. And this doesn't change even for Black women who are educated. Our numbers are staggering, even compared to white women who have high school degrees. Black workers are twice as likely to be unemployed and underemployed as white workers. And Black workers with a college degree are more likely to have higher levels of unemployment and underemployment than similarly educated white workers. We know the wealth disparities. We've heard a lot about them, and COVID-19 has shown us the multiple pandemics that this country has faced for years and years. The average wealth of African Americans with a bachelor's degree or higher is less than that of a white high school graduate. White households are more likely to be homeowners. We'll talk about that in a minute, in comparison to 44 and 45% of African American and Latinx households. And Black people make up 42% of those who are homeless in the United States out of the 554,000 who are homeless. And yet Black people only make up 12% of US general population. And sadly, Latinx make up 17% of the general population, but 24% of those living in poverty. And we ask, how did we get here? Well, as I said, St. Joseph Center, many of you are dedicated to doing whatever it takes to save our families, to house our families, to feed our families. But we haven't always talked about the why, the how. And so we want to take some time today to educate you, for those who have not yet explored these areas, and for those of you who have, to inspire you to begin to speak out, not just about what we're doing to feed and serve, but what our families are experiencing as they face disparities every day. And we are on the front line witnessing that very thing. So when we say there's structural and institutional racism, what exactly are we saying? What are we referring to? Slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and mass incarceration. I've been inspired of late to actually put some bullet points up so we don't just talk and numb ourselves to the severity of slavery and what we're really talking about. So I want to reflect on some points that will bring it home. What are we talking about when we say slavery? 17th and 18th century in the United States, 400 years ago, my people were kidnapped from the continent of Africa. I use that word kidnapped because it's something we can all relate to. We may not be able to visualize slavery. Oh, why are we still talking about it? But some of us worry about our kids being kidnapped if they play in the front yard. So let's use that word, kidnapped. And most sold into slavery. So that means property. And most slaves ended up in the South on tobacco and later cotton plantations. And slaves became a very important part of the American economy and industries. Those industries became very reliant upon what slaves were able to produce, namely cotton. And as legal property, slaves were used as collateral, as a wealth building mechanism. And here's this. Of course, slaves were prohibited from learning to read and write. Movement was restricted. Female slaves were raped. Why do I call that out? Because again, we've become so numb. We don't really know how to connect. If I wasn't a slave, if my great-great-grandfather's grandfather was a slave, how does that affect me? Because the history of kidnapping and history of rape still flows through our blood. It's baked in to our systems. And we know that the 13th Amendment passed in 1865. I have more to say about that. And Jim Crow, what are we talking about there? It's not just that fountain that we've seen in movies, but we're talking about state and local Black codes and laws that legalized racial segregation and controlled for how and where Black people, ex-slaves, lived and worked. And you know, what's interesting, as I did my research, many of those early KKK members were Confederate veterans. And they worked hard to reject the Reconstructionist policies that many Black people were fighting for. And that's how so many Black men were hung. Black people were murdered because they were fighting for their freedom. Jim Crow required segregation in waiting rooms and hotels, in areas of trains and buses. I'm reminded in early 1970s when we moved to the Valley, and my brother and I, we walked around and went to a park and we went swimming, came back at the end of the day and told my mom we went swimming. And her question in 1972 was, they let you swim? Because in Muncie, Indiana, they did not allow Black people to swim in the public pools. Redlining, some of you have been hearing and learning more about this, but this again is this systemic and intentional denial of mortgages, loans, insurance, and other services based on race and location. Again, creating housing segregation, much of what we are living today. The segregation that we see in our communities, in our neighborhoods was baked in, and it was choreographed, and it was intentional. In 1930, the government adopted these practices of drawing these lines in certain communities, making it easier for banks and inspiring banks to invest and to deter investment based on the area. And you can imagine what they used, a color coding system. Green meaning best, yellow declining, meaning it was starting to get more colored in nature, and red meaning hazardous based on where Black people lived. So Black areas were rated red, as I mentioned, and the mortgage loans were hard to come by, if at all. That's why you see such low home ownership in the Black community, which is the most important wealth building mechanism that families can use to this day. And the white areas were labeled green and inspired investment. And though we saw an end in 1968, we can still see that those areas that were redlined are still usually more Black and brown in terms of who's living there, and less investment. And mass incarceration. I want to go back to the 13th Amendment, this clause that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And so you see lawmakers began to use that clause to make petty offenses where Blacks would break those Black codes and found guilty, and then returned back to those plantations, and those plantation owners then paid. So again, the business of arresting Black folks became very, very lucrative. And hundreds of white men were hired by states to police Black people, to arrest them, to imprison them, and return them back to those plantations. And they call it peonage. It is believed that in the passing of the 13th Amendment, more than 800,000 Blacks were part of this system. And again, 3 areas and times within our lifetime of 1973 to 86, we saw policies that increased the imprisonment and varieties of felonies. 87 to 91, a sharp growth of state imprisonment for drug offenses. And 1994, the 3 strikes saw significant increase in the length and number of people imprisoned. And today, Black males account for 34% of the total male population. Explicit and implicit bias are part of what has made this country what it is today. Explicit, where we see racism straight out, but what we also have to note is that implicit bias, those forms of bias that are unconscious, produce the same manifestations of discrimination, stereotyping, microaggressions, violence, and favoritism. And we see that even in our sector. Implicit bias can affect who gets hired, who managers trust with assignments, and who gets promoted. And we have to begin to ask ourselves, does our provider workforce reflect the racial diversity of those we serve. A Spark study in 2018 challenged us and found that the answer is no. In our sector, the vast majority of people working in our sector are white, even though the vast majority of the people we serve are of color. And so as an agency, we began to change that and reflect on that. Me just being an African-American CEO does not make my agency diverse. So my executive team and I began to intentionally recruit people with lived experience and expertise. We softened degree requirements and we diversified staff at all levels. We worked with our partners to find folks with lived experience of homelessness, of mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, and incarceration. So we gave people credit for experience, and we did everything we could to change or adapt our educational requirements and those barriers that would keep people from doing this great work with us. I'm happy to say that in 2013, we were not where we were, but I can say today we are in a much better place. Our numbers in 2013 were sadly in keeping with that Spark study. 60% of our managers were white, even though the vast majority of people we were serving were of color. Today, 40% of our managers are white and 35% are Black, 18% are Latinx. So we've done what we could to look at who's in management and who has power in our organization. We've done the same thing for non-management positions. And I will tell you, 2013, similar to the Spark study, vast majority of our agency, almost 50% were white. Today, those numbers are significantly different. It's really calling upon all of us to make a change, and I'm happy to talk more at the end when we have Q&A. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Felicia. And it's very clear that understanding racial disparities and the history that got us here is so critical in doing this work. So thank you very much for rooting us there. And now I'd like to invite Erica Holzauer to share about RCAC's approach to this work and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee that she leads. Take it away, Erica.
Okay, I may be on mute as the hashtag for 2020, I just have to say. Welcome and good morning. And I think I have to start with, I am super honored to be part of this panel with these amazing leaders. As we planned this session and Monica led the way, it was incredible to see the work that is happening and the work that we could potentially do and how important it was, that networking piece. Even as planning the session, there was a lot of the times that I was taking notes and going like, that's a great idea. So I applaud you for being in this session. I think that if 80% of you are ready for action, you're in the right place. And let's hope that we can move the other 20% to start taking action. I think I'm going to start with, I think we had a great introduction, so thank you, Monica, for that. And leading the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at RCAC has not been an easy task. And I got to start with that because it is misleading if I sell it at this is the best thing you're going to do and it's going to be super easy. It is a very difficult task. And let me tell you why. We're having uncomfortable conversations internally and externally as we look at the practices of RCAC. So that piece in itself, you've got to get over that hump of being in that uncomfortable situation or conversations. So let me talk about who we are. So Rural Community Assistance Corporation, and I think this should advance on its own, but it's not. There we go. So we are a nonprofit organization founded in 1978. Our headquarters are in Sacramento, but we serve 13 Western states. We operate in rural America. And we have staff that are throughout the states, right? So we have about 60% of our staff have home offices. So we kind of have a very wide representation throughout the states that we serve. And who are our clients? Our clients are those that provide the services to those communities that are experiencing the injustices and the systemic racism, families that face those disparities. So we provide the assistance to the nonprofit organizations, the community housing development organization, tribal entities, local government, water and wastewater association, and public housing authorities. So we are the ones that are providing the assistance to those that have the connection to the ground, the grassroots organizations, those that have the experiences with those that are affected by a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, and that continues to be the topic of the current state. So what kind of services we provide? We provide the technical assistance, we do leadership training, strategic planning, economic development training. We provide loans, short-term and long-term, to the organizations that we assist. So now we're going to talk a lot about the strategy that we took as far as the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this started in 2015. And one of the things that we learned really quick was that there is you have to take the approach of, why are we doing this? So what's the problem that we needed to solve? So we did a lot of soul searching internally. And how are we going to get there, right? And what was the outcome that we wanted at the end of the day? Now, we also look at the past, what has worked in the past. And I mean, this is something that has been going on for many, many years, but the initiative to really be intentional, as Alicia was talking about making a change and making that difference, is something that is newer to the entire industry, right? And so although we looked at the past, it is a systemic problem that we have had in the past. What we look at the future is it has to be that intentional one. So what we looked at the past in how we were doing our business as usual, we started looking at a couple of things that we internally, non-intentional, were doing wrong to promote diversity amongst the organization. Now we started drafting the plan. How are we going to get there? What are the steps that we needed? Who needs to be at the table to have the conversations, to make the decisions? And the most critical piece is, how do we measure success? And I'll talk about the success a little bit later, but that is the piece where most of the work that you do, you have to somehow say, we are at this level, right? So the measuring of the success has become a little bit of a challenge, but we'll talk about challenges. Now, the support equals success. In our case at RCAC, the support started at the board level, which is great because it is a top-down. So the people that are making the decisions, the board of directors, the senior leadership team, are part of these efforts. Now, what happened is we started looking at the organization as a whole, and we realized back in 2015 that within 5 years, we would have staff, 60% of the staff eligible for retirement. So let me say that again. 60% of staff within 5 years would retire. So what that does to the company culture, what is it going to happen? We're going to have 60% staff new within 5 years. It was a huge change, right? And so it could be looked as two ways, is the fear that the company culture was going to be lost, the fear that things were going to change and not knowing what that change looked like, or taking that as an opportunity, right, to make intentional actions to increase the diversity, to work on the equity, to work on the inclusion piece. And so that's exactly what the board decided to do. Now, we were fortunate that the board decided that that was a great initiative because they also allocated resources to the initiative. And they were the ones that decided that the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee needed to be formed, and we started working on that, right? So in this top-down approach, one of the benefits is that the people that make the decisions are in it, right? versus if you're starting from the bottom, is maybe a little bit more difficult to get things approved, to get new policies established. Because we were fortunate to have the top-down approach, when we propose as a committee, here is the job description review, here is what we're going to do, those policies are easier to be approved. And in most cases, a lot of those policies start from the board saying, we need to look at this piece of the organization. So we're doing this work, not just internally, but we're also looking at externally. Who do we hire? Why do we hire them? Are we giving the same opportunity to the minority business owners? What are we doing to not only work in our internal processes, but the external processes? These initiative started by, it was almost like a two-pronged initiative. The first one was the board saying, we see that we're going to be in a transition, and we want to make sure that that transition includes diversity. And the second piece is the funding sources, lenders and funders were asking, what is your diversity, inclusion, or equity and inclusion policy? So we were getting it from the external side to say, what are you doing as far as this initiative? And from internally saying, like, we really have to look at this. So what we did as a committee, we started with the basic. And I gotta warn you that the basic, when you start talking about the definitions, there is a little bit of a potential challenge to get stuck in that definition, right? So you can only define things as long, but you need to be able to move from talking and making that definition work to actually actions, right? So you could be in an eternal loop of like, what is our mission as a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee? And so this is what we came up. RCAC fosters an inclusive workplace environment where our colleagues and partners are valued and treated with respect so that the organization and people we serve can excel. So we not only want this for us at RCAC, we want this for outside of RCAC, right? How do we put that seed out into the communities that we're working with? Again, back to definitions. So don't get stuck on those, because this is the piece where a lot of the times I see that organizations are getting stuck on trying to define. Now, when we talk about diversity, the first challenge that we had is everybody that we talked about when we were coming up with the diversity was all, the first thing that everybody go to is it is a brown or white. Now, we all know that that's not true, right? So when we talk about diversity, we need to be able to recognize that it goes beyond the color of the skin. Diversity is all the ways we are different from one another, including in thinking, background, experience, and culture. And that is our definition. If you notice, what our definition doesn't say anything about your ethnic background. It doesn't say whether you're going to be brown or white. It talks about differences that we have as individuals that go beyond that color of the skin. And so that is one of the big pieces that we had as a committee to take away, is to be able to train and educate and provide this information to the staff, so we would get out of thinking it's a brown or white is what diversity is, that it is beyond that, that it is internally what we're thinking about. We're thinking about how are you different, or what that diversity inside of each of us, right? We also talked about the equity piece. So we define equity, and this is the most recent definition because we started as a committee in 2015. It was the Diversity Inclusion Committee. And so later on, as things change and as things evolve, we added equity to our name, and also we define equity. And so one of the things when you talk about equity, we need to make sure that we recognize that equity is not equality, right? So when we talk about equity, we wanted to make sure that we talk about what we need to succeed. What I need to succeed is different than what somebody else may need, right? So that equity is what we define in here. So we recognize that individuals have unique talents talents and need, and our CAC is committed to identify, providing, and supporting opportunities for individuals to grow, thrive, and advance in meeting their goals and within the organization. So if you notice that the definition is not saying we're just going to give $100 to everybody equally. We're going to say what the individual needs in order to grow and advance in meeting their own goals. My goals and somebody else's goals are different. My needs are different than somebody else. And so with these definitions, we recognize that equity does not mean equality. And so the last definition was inclusion. So when we talk about inclusion, and this is a challenging one when you talk about how do you measure that, right? So we can measure diversity by statistics and numbers, and I can go into our HR department and pull a list where I may be able to get some of that diversity numbers, right? I may be able to get some equity numbers knowing what we provide and how we have allocated our resources. Now, when you talk about inclusion, this is a feeling. Do I feel included at our CAC? So how do you measure feelings? It is challenging to say we are successful in inclusion because we do X. So this is where I think a lot of the people get a little stuck on measuring that success. Now, happiness at our CAC, if I am happy working for our CAC, I may be able to say that I feel included, right? But not necessarily. I may just be happy because it's a great organization, but I may not feel so included. So this is a piece that is still in the works. I'm bringing in things that have worked, things that are on, like we're working on, and most importantly, some of the challenges. Because I think it's important that if you're here in this session, that you hear the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So I think this is the piece where you gotta spend more time on how do you define, how do you measure the inclusion? So what we said for inclusion, we said inclusion embraces the diverse aspects that make each of us unique, yet universally human. I'm gonna say it again, yet universally human. We're all human. And ensures that everyone has a voice and opportunity to contribute to the well-being of the organization. So the inclusion piece talks about what the individuals, right, what our capital, human capital that we have at our CAC, what their contributions do to the organization, right, and how those contributions help us be better. We also define our goal. As a committee, we said our goal was to enhance, grow, and serve our communities and partners. And again, our initiative or our intent in this work, it goes beyond the staff. It goes beyond just the organization, because we are the technical assistance providers, because we are out in the communities, we are helping the organizations in those communities that have the inequalities and have the injustices happen to them. We feel that we are also responsible to make sure that our partners continue to embrace these initiatives or develop the initiative. So we, as a committee, decided, okay, so now we need to set up some goals of what we want to do. And again, this is a long process. So I'm talking about, the work of 3 years. And so for some, it may seem like this is going to be really easy, and in the next 6 months we'll be there. So I gotta say, this is a lot of work that happens over time. And it happens over time because it morphs and it changes and it starts to take the place of what is needed. And there's a lot of lessons learned on the way, right? So we hired a consultant to do a strategic planning for the committee. And that was a great thing that we did, because we were doing great work internally, but we had 20 different approaches and 20 different things that we're doing. And so what we did is, in that strategic session, we were able to define 3 goals for the committee. So we had increased staff and board diversity. So that was all about the recruitment, all about the training. We wanted to raise our staff and board's cultural competence. So that was directed straight to the board, who, by the way, were the ones that started with the idea of this is a great idea. So now it was like, how do we help train the board and provide that competence to the board, so when we're coming in with the initiatives and the changes to the policies, that it is well received and it is understood that this is the direction that we're going. So we also said serve diverse communities with the highest level of respect of cultural values. And this was particularly special because we do a lot of the work in the Native American communities. And so we realized and recognized that we needed to step up our cultural competency to be able to deliver our services to the different communities that we were serving, right? And so the last one was integrate our commitment into our business operations. So this was not about, this is what we're going to do. This is who we are going to be from now on, right? Based on those goals, what we were able to do is we put them in 3 different buckets. We had the manager development, we had the internal culture, we had the recruitment pipeline. And we developed the objective for those, and those became subcommittees. So as part of the subcommittees, we had a lead, and then we actually recruited staff to come in and assist us on the work, right? So the subcommittees are formed by a committee member who is the lead and staff that are interested in those particular areas. So there was a lot of try, fail, and success. And again, I'm not selling you a crazy, easy thing to do. What I'm saying is this is a lot of work, but it's a lot of really good work. And you cannot fail if you don't try. And so what I'm saying is I'm inviting you all, right, to try and fail and try and succeed, because it is important that we go beyond talking about it, that we go beyond the definition, and you spend a lot of time on the planning of it, that the action piece falls behind. And when you're ready to move on to action, things change. So we are seeing right now a significant increase into the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, right? It is now a thing. If you notice today at Housing California, the whole day is about the diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is the topic because it's important. It is the topic that you need to take actions. And so we cannot take actions if we're afraid to fail, right? And I think that's one of the things that we have learned at RCAC is that we really have to stop talking about what the best definition is. We need to be able to take those actions, to change the policies, to make the suggestions, and then we can see, are we in the right direction, right? The biggest lesson we had was before we started on our strategic planning session, we were doing a lot of really good work as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So it was RCAC plus DEI. And that resulted in a lot of great work and a lot of great articles and a lot of great trainings. But one of the biggest lessons is that you cannot talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as an addition to your organization. What you need to do is you need to become DEI. So RCAC is DEI. And so what we did is we started to reframe the conversation. And instead of sending a nudge on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and nudges are like the articles that we publish internally. So instead of sending a nudge out to the staff, what we realize is that we need to look at who we are as an organization and where that diversity, equity, and inclusion is integrated, already part of it. And so what we did is we looked at our core values. So our core values were already defined prior to the committee being formed. So this is leadership, collaboration, commitment, quality, and integrity. And guess what? Diversity, equity, and inclusion is incorporated in all of those values that we had. So we reframed the message, and instead of talking as diversity, equity, and inclusion as a separate thing, we went back to our core values. and we look at the definitions that were already done, and all of those definitions included some sort of diversity message in them, right? So we train the staff, we train the managers, and we train everybody at our annual meeting. And so we've done a lot of trainings as it results to looking at the organization that already has that diversity, equity, and inclusion piece integrated, right? So we are already DEI. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to try to get you to the stretch zone. And so we're not going to go in stretch zone like yoga type stretch zone. What I like to do is I like to take your mind into that space where we have the conversations. So this is I attended a training or a series on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the last couple months. And that was from Chan Zuckerberg Initiatives, put a series of DEI trainings that were amazing. So part of that, this was part of those trainings, and I'm borrowing in from them because I thought that it was like, it talks to me. And I think it's better to understand the place where we have to be when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in that stretch zone, we have you in the happy place. This is where you have your sunglasses and you're happy and you're comfortable, right? This is the comfortable zone. It's where we are normally, right? And then we have that area where we have the panic zone. In the panic zone is where is the shutdown, where you're not comfortable, but you're in a shutdown state. That's the place that we don't want to be. What I like everybody to be on is that uncomfortable zone. We need to be in that zone where we can build the resiliency to those uncomfortable conversations. We got to be in the place where we are okay having an uncomfortable conversation. And that is the job of the committee at RCAC. We are taking staff from the happy place, from not being aware to that awareness, which is when change happens. So we're taking staff on every meeting, every training that we do is taking the staff out of that happy zone without going to the panic zone. The panic zone, everybody shut down, nobody wants to see, you got the blinders on, and it's not happening. In the stretch zone is where we actually recognize that. A good example, implicit bias, right? So we do a little training about implicit bias. And although we are not professionals, we kind of go and encourage staff to check on their own biases. And why we do that? So the minute that you have the awareness, you have the control to change how your reactions. You have the control to say, is this decision I'm making based on a bias that I may have? And so it is all about that awareness. Again, that's where the change is going to happen. If we have the blinders on, it's not going to happen, right? If we are so uncomfortable that we don't want to know about it, it's not going to happen. But we have to build that resiliency, right? We have to get uncomfortable with or comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations. And I think we heard that throughout today, and I think we will continue to hear that. So one of the things that we did to continue bringing staff to that stretch zone is we started what is called the listening sessions. And, we're waiting for a final name on that. We're putting it out to vote and see what the actual name is. But the diversity, equity, and inclusion took a leap of faith in the last annual meeting. And what we did is we asked staff to send questions, comments, and suggestions in advance to get us questions about what they wanted to do. So I'm getting the note that it is time to go. So really quickly, we got a lot of questions and really, really thoughtful conversations happened. So what we did is we decided that having a conversation with staff once a year was not enough. So we have created a bi-monthly listening session where we would invite the staff to join us and have those uncomfortable conversations. So that's something that we're doing. The last thing I have is you have to expect unfinished business. This is not a checkbox you're going to check off. It is intentional work that has no end date. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Monica. And I think if you have any questions, that is our committee email address. And thank you so much for the opportunity. Back to you, Monica.
Great. Thank you very much, Erica, for that great presentation. And thank you for acknowledging the challenges in doing this work and understanding that we are all here, not as experts in this work, but we can share the good, the bad, and the ugly that might take place. So thank you for highlighting that. And now let's have Lily Luhaler share about what MidPen is working on in their internal work and their staff efforts to create an inclusive environment. Go for it, Lily.
Okay, thank you, Monica. Let's see, I'm going to start my video and see if everybody can see everybody. Hi, everyone. It's, as John A. Powell mentioned this morning, it's a little strange to not be able to see you, but we're really excited that you're here. Lillian Luhaler with the MidPen development team, MidPen Housing development team. I want to thank Monica for convening today, and Alicia for providing context, and Erica for definitions. It's been wonderful to work on this panel and learn from these other women. And I want to thank all of you who are here with us today. The chat has been amazing, and the sharing of resources and experience. And that's certainly how we're going to be able to continue this work together. This panel this morning, I think, was titled something along the lines of how to get started. And I just want to say that I don't think there's a single way to get started. I don't think there's a right way to get started, but it is really important to get started on this work and to journey through it together. And then along the lines of what Erica was sharing is that regardless of how you start, when you start, where you start, what work you start with, there are going to be bumps on the road, there will be challenges, and there will also be achievements and progress. And I know we are all housers, so we have the resolve and the stamina for this work. Let's see if I can get my slides going here. So MidPen Housing is located in the Bay Area. We have about 500 staff members, and we serve the larger San Francisco and Monterey Bay Area regions from Santa Rosa to Monterey. We have 4 core business areas: our property management team, resident services, our corporate operations, and our real estate development teams. And together, we provide housing for about 18,000 residents every night. Some of our staff work closely with traditional sources of power like city council, and they have the opportunity to observe how representative or not representative that power is. And some of our staff have incredible power to impact the daily lives of our residents through their work, whether it's help with home maintenance and apartment maintenance, or connection with benefits and services. MidPen's mission is to provide a safe, affordable housing. That's pretty clear for us. The second clause, to foster diverse communities that allow people from all ethnic, social, and economic backgrounds to live in dignity, harmony, and mutual respect, has always been part of our mission since we were founded 50 years ago. And I feel really lucky to work somewhere where our founders had that vision. It is harder to make tangible and to deliver on. And so this journey that I'll share with you today is really how we are starting to make conscious the work on racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have called that work Abide. That's our internal agenda to create a sense of belonging, to strengthen our inclusion, diversity, and equity. And of course, we couldn't resist the opportunity to create another acronym, just what we all need. The objectives of Abide are to cultivate a diverse workforce that's representative of the communities we serve, to increase cultural appreciation among our employees and throughout our communities, to create an environment where everyone feels valued, included and that they belong, and to ensure that all MidPen employees and residents have equal opportunities to advance their lives. So again, this is MidPen's journey and how we started. Your journey will look different. It'll have different challenges and successes. I would echo Erica and Felicia's experience and suggestions that it is helpful to have objectives you're trying to achieve and metrics by which you're going to measure those as you start out on this work, whether those are broad or more specific. It's really helpful to focus in on what you're going to work on and where you're trying to go. MidPen's journey started in the fall of 2017 when DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion emerged on a specific department staff survey. So our work really started at the staff level, sort of in contrast to Erica and our CAC's experience. We really had a bottom-up approach to this, but it did resonate with our leadership. And in the early 2018, DEI was incorporated into our corporate goals. I have to really appreciate Jan Lindenthal, who's our Chief Real Estate Officer and has been a champion throughout the DEI work. And it is really important with a bottom-up approach that you have those champions who can be key links to leadership. In mid-2018, ABIDE took form. At least the acronym was there and the objectives started taking shape. And during that summer, there were lunch forums where all staff were invited. It was an open invitation, voluntary, to come and talk about what our ABIDE, our DEI mission, our DEI journey would look like. Those lunch sessions really were the genesis of what has become the ABIDE Advisory Council and some other threads of work that continue through the ABIDE Council's work today and our ABIDE journey. In the fall of 2018, we hired the Winters Group as our consultant. I would say that the selection of a consultant is critical. For us, it was really important to bring a consultant on who had experience and capacity to help us navigate this work and lay out a plan. And the selection of your consultant is important. I think that match is probably obvious to everybody, why, but the match of the organization and the consultant is a really important one because it is a real partnership, and we've had a lot of back and forth with the Winters Group about how we progress this work. Also that fall, our board and leadership did a cultural competency assessment. One of the benefits for us of having the work start bottom up is that our staff is very diverse, more diverse than our board and leadership. So there is some real compelling work and narrative that comes out of the staff that, in some ways we need the board and leadership to catch up to and on. Let's see, and then really our 2019 annual meeting was focused on DEI work and was a real, I think, demonstration of our commitment to the work. Mary Frances Winters, who's our consultant, was the keynote speaker. She's very dynamic and compelling and fun, frankly. She is very engaging, and it's helpful to, I think, have someone who is so comfortable having uncomfortable conversations to bring 500 people into that conversation. We spent some time, really trying to create a foundational understanding for all of our staff around what the work would look like, why it was important. And at the same time, 500 people, you're not going to have the same level of cultural competence. Everyone is on their own individual path and at their own pace, as well as the organization, sort of its own organism on its own path and pace. And so we're constantly trying to bring everybody along. Some people are pushing, some people, are less focused. And I think that's just one of the challenges that everyone embarking on this journey is going to experience. So at the end of 2019, or going into late 2019, we had this great path forward. We had launched ABIDE. thought it would be, you know, very linear, easy to understand what the next steps were, not necessarily easy work, but we thought we had a plan laid out. In the summer of last year, just about a year ago, we launched the Abide Council. We had taken nominations. Folks could nominate themselves or colleagues. We worked really hard to have representation across MidPen and diversity on a number of axes. So looking at experience, demographics, role within the company, and have a really wonderful group that's come together to lead that work internally. So we kicked off in the fall with the idea that the council would be create strategy and assessment tools and advise our executive team on how to then weave all of this DEI work into all aspects of our work. We anticipated having focused working groups and opportunities for education and engagement for all the staff. And this has largely happened, but you know what they say about the best laid plans, right? And 2020 has frankly looked and felt a lot more like this. You know, there's been highs and lows, there's been twists and turns, there's been a pandemic, we're in the middle of what I hope is a racial reckoning. 2020 has been an incredible year, and I think that as challenging as life has been for everyone, it's also been challenging for our Abide Council. So we do have amazing energy on the council. It's really a demonstration to me of the value of creating diverse and inclusive spaces. There's been a wealth of ideas and learning opportunity. I think people feel very supported in the work that they're embarking on and the learning we're doing together. And it's challenging. You know, during COVID, we all have more demands on our time and energy. We have folks who are doing multiple jobs as caregivers and teachers, and multiple jobs as they're covering for colleagues as well. So that has been a challenge. And I will share a few sort of, I think the pro and the con, the good and the bad of some of the stuff that we've done. Most of, I think, our challenges are also partnered with real opportunities and successes. And I think that's helpful in continuing on this work. So one challenge is always that there's prioritizing and competing demands, right? So on the part of the council, some of that is that there's work that the council itself needs to do to build trust with these folks who are from different or parts of our organization, who have not worked together, who have different backgrounds, who have different experiences. And so we need to be doing that work together and setting priorities for the work going forward. And at the same time, there's a real eagerness to see results and change from the entire company as well as from the council itself. So that those are, you know, hard to have both things happening at the same time. Basically, we have, you know, more ideas and desires than we have time. We've also realized that while the council can be a very powerful tool for change, we need the entire company or large portions of it to be doing work too, that the council itself can't be the only change agent. And that is really part of evolving the role of the council and our understanding of it, what we can and can't do, and where we really need leadership. And that's one of the challenges of a bottom-up approach, is that sometimes, you know, you need to work to bring leadership along if it wasn't leadership's idea in the first place. So that's one thing that we're thinking about right now, is how do we continue that educational journey and engagement with the leadership so that we can have very effective change. You know, we, like Erica talked about DEI being sort of infused and integral to all work, we really want that as a result. And one of the challenges is that sometimes if you're trying to infuse it and integrate it, you're not specifically calling it out. And we've learned that it is really important to actually call out some of the work that you're doing so that it's recognizable for the entire company and recognized. So I think the other piece that I would just mention here is that COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement have brought challenges, but they've also brought us opportunity. So I'm not sure if you've noticed, but in our Abide objectives, we did not explicitly name racial equity. Black Lives Matters movement has created really the necessity and the opportunity to bring that language and purpose more explicitly into our DEI work. And it's also really given a sense of urgency, I think, going back to some of the statistics and understanding of inequity that Felicia walked us through. We really understand why this work is urgent and critical. It has been a very twisty, windy road, and I'm going to go back one slide here. And we have been making progress all along as we go on our twists and turns and our ups and our downs. We have 4 working groups that have been established around 4 objectives that do tie back to and relate to our initial objectives. The working groups have all selected one key piece that they're going to work on this year. Those are the sort of pieces highlighted in red here in this 3-year plan. And I think we're reinvigorating really the leadership, education, and engagement as part of our overall strategy, as well as these focus areas, which you can see also are very, have a lot of overlap with what Felicia and Erica have been working on in their organizations in terms of hiring, and the working group number 3, as well as the employee communications and education, and then looking externally to how we spend our money and encourage other vendors and organizations we work with to also have DEI practices to really lift up some of the women and people of color owned businesses that we work with and want to work with. And I'm going to leave you with a quote from, I've been really struck by how powerful some of the protest music coming out of the response to George Floyd's murder has been. And I just would say that coming back to the theme of starting, it's really to start this work and to start the journey. And I think that we're all, here to support each other, hopefully, in it. I'll stop sharing. Monica.
All right, thank you so much, Lily, for sharing. And we got so many great questions. Now we have time to just answer probably a few of them. But please, stay active in the chat, everybody, because also the comments there have been great. So I see a lot of questions, and we're bringing the whole panel back now. Anybody can feel free to chime in on this, but we see a lot of questions about accountability. So for instance, how do we bridge the gap between an organization that publishes a statement of support for racial justice and an organization actually taking concrete action for achieving that justice? So does anybody want to chime in on that?
Well, I'll just say it is really hard to be a part of an organization that is becoming and beginning to understand our role in addressing racial inequities. St. Joseph Center was founded on the principles of justice. Someone asked, does the work we're doing align? Yes, it was about justice. It was about homelessness and justice and making sure that people have the rights of others, even though they're living impoverished lives and in impoverished communities. But I do believe that as we've put out the Black Lives Matters statements, we need to be about the business of ensuring that Black lives are lifted up in our agencies. If I worked for an agency that felt inconsistent, I think it would be important in a safe way, because I don't want people to put their jobs on the line, because that does happen, but to bring people together, perhaps on the front lines, or people who are in the department with you, to say, hey, we'd like to actually live out some of these amazing things outlined in this statement. Where can we begin? because we see this as hopeful projections of a future way we might operate as an organization. What role can I play in actualizing these things? So you're not really calling out your leadership as being less than honest. You're really saying, what can I do to bring these alive in our work, in our daily work? And maybe that would help get those leaders who wrote that statement to feel a little bit bad about the inconsistencies between the statement and the work itself.
Monica, I can add a little bit to that because we had a statement, right? We had an internal statement about the Black Lives Matter, and then we have an external statement. And one of the things that we realized is that we were not the experts, right, as RCAC, to do that kind of work. But what we did is the staff recommended a list of the organizations that are on the ground doing that work. And so the board and the executive director designated $5,000 to be spread amongst those organizations that staff recommended. So we recognized that we wanted to help, and we also recognized that we were not the strongest as moving that initiative forward, but we were able to contribute some.
Monica, I would echo Felicia's sort of encouragement of gentle pressure there, and think that individuals can do that. Also, if you have a council or committee, you know, that can be a role of the council and the committee, is to have that accountability and gentle pressure. And then the other piece that I would add is one of the challenges that we found is data. And I think asking, do we have the data? Do we know where we fall in terms of how our staffing looks to the people? How representative is it of the communities that we're serving? Do we know who we're hiring? Do we know what our hiring pools look like? Do we know who's leaving the organization and why? Those are, you know, examples around staffing. I'm similarly asking for questions about how we contract and who we pay, how we spend our money. Those can be powerful questions, and they can be really hard to answer if you're not collecting that data. So that's a really good sort of first step to also be taking with, and it's a way to engage some of the departments that may not feel like they have as much ability to work with communities or be involved in those questions. You know, it's a way for me to like really say to the accounting team, I need your help in this work, right? And the accountants are not necessarily thinking of that they have a role in it, but they have a huge role to play.
Great, thank you. And we're running out of time, but does anybody have any thoughts on responding to a lot of questions we got about how to avoid tokenizing staff of color that we onboard, how to avoid, you know, the trauma that they might be experiencing through all of these DEI efforts? Any quick thoughts on that? Felicia, I see you unmute.
Well, I don't think any of us have a corner on this. What we need to make sure is that when we're asking questions, someone even said, should we be looking at the imposter syndrome when we're hiring people of color? And my answer was, and I don't know how the panelists feel, but you don't start with imposter syndrome. You start with white fragility. You start talking about white supremacy. So you're not really having to target those people of color, those indigenous folks who are in our agencies. They don't have to be the ones to speak up and teach us. We need to be taking the lead to talk about white fragility, white supremacy. If people feel like imposters, maybe it's because the system has made them feel that way. Maybe we should start acknowledging the truth. I think that's the place to start, and not to identify these folks as, okay, now you're going to lead my Black campaign, you're going to lead our diversity campaign. You know, we need to change that around and take the pressure off of people of color to keep carrying all of this water.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm getting the notification that we are out of time. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I hope that all the attendees got something out of this, and please continue on this work, and please enjoy the Housing California Unconference. Thank you so much, everybody.
Great, thank you.